ketosis often would actually go down. Like you said, you'd still be in ketosis, but it would often be a lower level of ketosis than people who were striving for ketosis would reach. And yet, despite that, a lot of people are getting amazing results. And so that was one of the first things that really blew my mind about carnivore, actually, because you might think, oh, well, this is lower carb than low carb, and so the reason that it's working better is because it's more ketogenic. But that's not the case at all, because it's not more ketogenic necessarily. I think that's because that there are two reasons that the carnivore diet works. Well, maybe three, depends on how you count. But one of them is the ketogenic part, definitely. A ketogenic diet is very, very healthy, and it doesn't have to be strongly ketogenic to be providing benefits for a lot of people. But the other part is the whole plant elimination and meat enhancement part, right?
Right.
So for people like you and me, the ketosis didn't seem to be that big of a deal in our particular healing. At least the difference between a low level of ketosis that you'd have on a carnivore diet and a high level of ketosis that you'd have on a more like traditional medically oriented ketogenic diet, that part didn't make a difference for us. But the plant elimination and the getting lots of nutrients from animal products themselves, that part mattered. But it turns out that it's still the case that there are people who can't go to that lower level of ketosis and still be getting enough benefit. So for them, the ketogenic part turns out to be a lot more important. And it could be about the ketones themselves. So for someone who maybe has some kind of brain condition like epilepsy, for example, it might matter to them how deep they are in ketosis. But for a lot of other people, the ketones are really just like a side effect showing how well they're burning fat.
Okay.
And so for some people, they're in mild ketosis, and that's because their ability to access their own fat or to burn it is somehow being impaired. And a very common cause for that would just be higher insulin, but there are other reasons that could happen as well.
So for years in carnivore space, I've always heard the word, it's long enough to be a phrase, but the word gluconeogenesis kind of scoffed at, and in a way of like, what do you think your body is turning steak into cake? It doesn't do that. But also saying it's a necessary thing in order for organs like your brain to function without eating carbs. Be glad that you have new gluconeogenesis happening. And I always just took it for that. Great. It's happening and it's a good thing. But it seems when I'm seeing some people who say, my gosh, I'm eating a pound of meat for lunch, a pound of meat for dinner, just like you, Kelly. I'm like, great. How's that going? Well, I mean, my glucose is over 100 and my ketones are at 0.1. Is that okay? Well, that's not what my numbers look like at all. Right?
Right.
So where do we stand? Where do you stand on gluconeogenesis?
Okay, so you've dived right into probably the most misunderstood topic in all of the ketogenic diet world. So gluconeogenesis, if you break it down, it just, gluco means glucose, neo means new, and genesis means create, right?
Okay.
So creating new glucose, or we could just think of it as glucose production, or GNG for short is often called. Okay. So GNG is always happening in your body because you need to have blood sugar. Not all of your cells can use fat for energy, and one of the very important tissues that can't use fat for energy is your brain. And so you have to have some level of glucose in your bloodstream at all times. And so when you're not eating, even if you're on a high carb diet, when you're not eating, you have to be managing like that. Your liver actually manages it and lets out a little bit at a time. Okay. And when you're not eating any glucose, that still has to come from somewhere. And a very common way that your body makes glucose is out of protein, but it also makes it out of byproducts of fat metabolism. So protein's not the only way that you can get glucose. But it can be. Around 2012, actually, close to when I first started blogging about carnivore diets, one of the first things that, this wasn't specifically carnivore, but one of the myths that was going around really heavily was that you have to, well, it's sort of a myth and sort of not. The idea was if you ate too much protein, your body would, like you said, and in fact, I think it was Jimmy Moore who came up with this idea that steak would turn into cake. That if you eat protein, your liver is going to just turn it into glucose and put it back in your bloodstream. Now, that's really not what happens.
Okay.
But the truth is that as you go higher and higher in protein, at a certain point, it will really start to turn down ketosis in a big way. So there's a lot of confusion because it doesn't happen right away and it doesn't happen straight. What's more happening is that protein sends a different signal to the body when you eat it than fat does. If you eat fat, you have two hormones that are kind of keeping track of your metabolic state, insulin and glucagon, and they oppose each other, and their ratio tells your body a lot about what kind of state you're in. And if you eat mostly fat and just a little bit of protein, and you're in a ketogenic state, your insulin is going to be low and your glucagon is going to be relatively high. So the ratio between those is going to be really low. You've got low insulin to glucagon. If you eat a little bit of protein, it doesn't really budge it. And so Ben Beekman has this beautiful presentation showing that if you're on a high-carb diet, your insulin to glucagon ratio is really sensitive to protein. You eat protein and suddenly it skyrockets. But if you're on a ketogenic diet and you eat a bit of protein, it just stays stable and everything should stay the same. And that's basically the case when you're in a ketogenic state and you're eating a moderate amount of protein. But if you eat a lot of protein over time with the higher portions, this will start to nudge the insulin up. And as soon as you get to a certain level, your body starts to say, hey, we're in a different state now. We're not in a ketogenic state anymore. And so we're going to shut down or reduce fat burning in favor of more glucose burning state.
Okay.
And so then your body starts using all this glucose. So what it can look like from the outside is you add a bunch of protein and suddenly your ketones drop off and your blood sugar goes up. But what's really happening is that it's just a set of signals has told your body what to use. It's not that the protein turned into sugar immediately. Okay. It's that your body went into a different state. People like you and me, when we started the carnivore diet, we didn't really have problems with insulin and hormonal state. We were generally pretty healthy. Yeah. And so we were able to eat a pretty large amount of protein without upsetting that balance.
Yes.
But for some people who have deeper or different health conditions than we had at the time, the amount of protein that they can eat before they go spiral out is just a lot lower.
So how do they fix that, Amber? What do we do? Is there a workaround? I mean, we're carnivores, so we love meat. We love large amounts of meat. It's literally all we're eating. So when you say to a carnivore, wow, you've got some underlying health issues, it's going to be hard for you to eat a lot of meat. They're like, I thought that's all I'm supposed to be eating.
Right.
Okay,
right.
So how do we help them get where they want to be, even with this, I guess, hurdle?
Right. So one way that they can know that this problem is applying to them is if they try what a lot of people will tell them to try to fix this, which is to fast.
Okay.
If you fast and your ketones go way up and you feel euphoria, your hunger goes away, and you start to lose weight, then fasting is probably not a problem for you, and you may be able to incorporate some form of fasting to help get over that hurdle, lower your insulin levels enough. But for a lot of people that are in this situation where they're more sensitive to high protein, what actually happens is when you tell them to fast, they get really tired, they get freezing cold, they might not even lose any weight. Yep. People on the internet will tell them they're lying, but they will literally not lose weight, and their ketones might even drop. Or they might get a little bit higher, but nothing like the 2.5 millimoles and over levels that people would normally get from fasting. So you can kind of use fasting as a test to see how well is your body using fat when you put it in the optimal situation to get fat off its own body. So The thing that I would suggest to do is something that a lot of people are really loath to do, because people are being told that if you want to lose fat, if you want the fat to come off your thighs, you can't be eating it. But from your body's point of view, if the fat's not coming off of out of your fat stores and flowing into your bloodstream so that your liver can burn it and generate all these ketones, if you're not seeing that, then there's something wrong in that process, and that means that you are probably in a low energy state, and you probably don't feel good, and your body definitely is not going to prioritize doing things like healing, being able to like remake tissue if there's tissue damage, or do any of the things it needs to do if it doesn't have that energy. In fact, your metabolism's just going to kind of get as efficient as possible. Okay. So the only way out of that is to give your body the energy that it needs, and that means eating fat. And even though it sounds like that's going to cause you to gain fat, in many cases it'll actually cause you to lose fat, as long as, and there's a big place where confusion comes in, you can't just take the same high protein that you were eating before and add like twice the fat on top of that. You have to actually take some of the protein back and give more fat until your appetite settles into using the fat instead of the protein for energy.
That right there is what I have seen most people do, including myself, when we say, okay, I'm going to try a high-fat version of carnivore. So me, I've always eaten 4 burger patties for lunch. That's a pound of meat. And typically 2 to 4 more for dinner, whatever I want that evening. So now, high-fat carnivore, I'm going to eat 4 burger patties for lunch with a stick of butter.
Right.
And eat the same pound of meat for dinner with a stick of butter. And for me, I was like, I didn't lose any more weight. I didn't really feel any better. And a lot of other people, I think, did that same thing to call it high-fat carnivore. But you're saying, and I've also been studying Dr. Annette Bosworth, who goes by Dr. Boz. I took a course with her, and she's saying it is not about just adding more fat. That is very important.
Yeah.
But it's about also, either you could phrase it, I guess, a couple ways. Limiting protein per sitting, which equates to spreading it out throughout the day.
Yeah.
Do you feel like that's is that what you're saying is a good tactic for folks? For some people?
It really is. And it comes back to that insulin to glucagon ratio. So if you want to, we were talking about how insulin to glucagon stays low and kind of gets locked in low when you're in a ketogenic state, and it keeps you in the ketogenic state. And a little bit of protein at a time doesn't budge it. A lot of protein at a time will. So if you look at the per day level, it might matter if you have 200 grams of protein in a day. That might send you out no matter how much you distribute it. But it's also going to matter like how long between like doses, right? So if you were going to have 120 grams of protein in a day, it might keep your ketosis more stable if you give yourself 30 grams and then wait a while, especially if you've enhanced that with fat. If your body senses not very much protein coming in, but a lot of fat coming in, that it will signal your body to continue to stay in a fat burning mode. If you load a bunch of protein first and then put fat after, your body might already be saying, oh, we don't really have very much fat. I'm going to use this protein for energy because I need energy. So the ordering and the frequency can matter as well, definitely.
Okay. What about people, and this is how I've been doing it. I've been taking approximately 4 ounces of steak per meal. And I know that seems very small by my standards. I've always been a volume eater, so this is like offensive to me. 4 ounces. Yes. Okay. But I'm trying this because I have seen so many of my group members who are struggling, and I know they are not lying. They are only eating meat. Some of them are dear friends. I trust them completely.
Yeah.
All right. So I take my 4 ounces, that's uncooked weight. And I'm adding, if it's a lean piece of meat, then I'm typically adding about 4 tablespoons of butter to bump that up to an 80-20 ratio, which means 80% of calories from fat. An easier way, I think I've heard you say this before, for every 1 gram of protein that a person is eating, if they eat 2 grams of fat, that equates to about an 80-20 ratio. Is that right?
Yeah, that's a good rule of thumb.
So I've been doing that I started off doing it 4 times per day. And I wanted it. I wanted all 4 meals. But I have found that I'm getting a little tired of that. Like, I literally don't always want all 4 meals, which is kind of interesting. I was eating about 3,000 calories per day.
Yeah, yeah.
And I was really loving it. It was a lot of butter, Amber. I mean...
And I bet you weren't gaining weight either, were you?
I lost 5 pounds. 5 pounds. And this
is not
from
possible, Kelly. It's calories.
I'd way upped my calories and went from, I've been at the same weight for many years other than pregnancy. I just have like a set point. And then I found myself 5 pounds below that. Like, what is this mystical thing that's happening? It's really weird. Also weird that I would find myself just naturally wanting to drop a meal. That's not me at all. Okay. Right.
Because
Interesting.
you just felt really satiated, right?
Yeah, I couldn't look at another bite of food. That's where it got. And again, that's not normally my style. I will take every bite I can have. Too. Throughout the satiation and even losing a little bit of body fat, I've been encouraging group members that if they are stuck and if this feels like in your soul, if you feel curious about this, I think that's a really big tell. If you hear something, you go, and you lean into it, your body might know. Your body knows better than I do, that's for sure. And people who were curious have said, why not just try? I've been encouraging people to start with the equation because everybody wants to know how much protein can I have. And the answer is, I can't know that. Dr. Boz would say to measure your glucose and your ketones. And she says to take glucose, divide by ketones, and that ratio, which she calls the Dr. Boz ratio, she says is a good indicator of how much protein a person can handle. Do you feel like there's something to that?
Yeah, it's normally called the glucose ketone index, the GKI. And I think Dr. Boz has her own different way of calculating it, because the normal one, you're comparing millimoles to millimoles, and in the United States we don't use millimoles for glucose, we use milligrams per deciliter, so you can't divide it, they're not comparable. And I do think that it is a pretty good indication of how how deeply into the ketogenic state you are and where your insulin and glucagon are.
Do you personally, for yourself, care? Do you care if you are producing ketones?
Well, yes and no. Okay. So I have to go into a brief diversion. So I started the carnivore diet in 2009, and I lost a lot of weight, cured a lot of problems, hummed along beautifully, and I had a very bad gut infection in 2018, followed by antibiotics and more gut infections, and I've begun to heal. But I had this space of a few years where I got quite sick. I gained a lot of weight. I had chronic fatigue and just I felt like I aged 10 years. But I'm starting to come out of that. During that time, I had fat malabsorption, and I didn't really put it together until recently. But that means, so no matter what I'm eating, which was the same as what I was eating all that other time, right? Basically, until I started experimenting with other things. But I would eat fat and my body wouldn't absorb it, so it would go right through my system. But that meant de facto I'm eating a higher protein diet, and I didn't really realize it.
Oh, yeah, right.
So that could have been part of my problem, that I was unable to get the fat that I needed to support my health. So the reason I dived into all that is because during that 8 years where I was in really good health, I didn't check my blood sugar and ketones often, but when I did, the ketones would always be somewhere around 0.7 and 1.5.
Okay.
And my blood sugar was usually around 75.
Yeah.
So I didn't have this phenomenon that a lot of people talk about their blood glucose going high. And I didn't seem to need the extra boost from ketones. And because I had lost all the weight that I felt I needed to lose, I wasn't really worried about getting my glucose lower or getting my ketones higher. And so I would do a spot check once in a while out of curiosity, but I wasn't really trying to. But then when I got sick, I started getting more interested in tracking different biometrics because I wanted to figure out what the heck was going on. Yeah. And at that time, I found that my ketones were lower, I had the fasting intolerance that I described earlier, which I didn't used to have. This came on after the illness.
Okay.
But I could eat, I could fast for a couple of days and my ketones would be still less than 2. And on the other hand, I could eat like a PKD style diet, which is another version of the 2-to-1 meat only diet. The paleo-medicinal one, Paleolithic ketogenic diet, and my ketones would go like up to 4,
Wow.
and I would feel really great. The only problem was that I was having this ongoing digestive thing.
Yes.
I did find that, and most people probably are just going to go no, but I did find that eating raw fat was a lot more digestible to me than eating, like say tallow or just fatty cooked meat. And so I was able to absorb it if I was eating more raw. And so that's one trick that people can sometimes use. I was wanting to ask you actually how your digestive system adapted to the high butter addition. Was it difficult at first or was it fine the whole time? Or?
Yeah, there were some moments, a few moments of adapting to that, because I did go kind of like from one day to the next. Now we do lower protein per meal, and now we add all the fat. I don't even have a gallbladder. So, yeah. So I had some moments of, oh no, overdid that. But for the most part, butter and fat trimmings do way better for me than liquid rendered fat.
Yeah. Liquid can sometimes go right through. Yeah.
Yes, and I hear that a lot. And as far as the raw fat, I do know quite a few carnivores who say exactly what you did, that they can handle it better raw than they can any other way. And for me, I just do a quick air fry, like 3 minutes on 400 degrees.
Oh, yeah. So it's pretty rare inside.
Yes.
Still. It's kind of solid on the inside.
Yes, and there's not a whole lot of liquid to pour off, so I'm keeping, and I don't pour it off anyway for that reason.
Yeah.
But I'm eating quite a bit of my fat that way. I was relying on mostly butter. Okay, this is a question I want to ask you too. Talking about Zofia Clemens?
Yes.
Okay, the PKD lady.
Yeah.
She is really big on 80-20, high fat. But a lot of us who are doing this, that I know at least, are relying pretty heavily on butter to hit those macros. Did I understand correctly? And I'm literally asking that because I do struggle to understand her. But did I understand correctly? She's into no dairy at all, including butter, right?
That's correct. Yeah. So she would eat a lot more of the fat trimming type fat that you described. I think that makes up a large part of her diet, or just really fatty meats. And a lot of so I've visited the clinic there and spent a lot of time with them. Wonderful people, but they use a lot of cured meat. It's just salt cured, so it doesn't have any weird additives.
Okay.
And the meat that they're curing is like, it looks like bacon, like it's just white with maybe a little strip of so it's really like chunks of fat that are in a sense raw because they're cured instead of cooked.
How do you feel about butter and dairy?
So dairy is a tricky one. A lot of people are fine with it. Like my friend Siobhan Huggins, when she first started carnivore, her staples were pork and cream cheese, and she made a lot of health progress eating that. But some people are sensitive to dairy, and there are many different ways you can be sensitive to dairy. It's complicated. Like you can be lactose intolerant, or you can have an allergy to the casein. But I think what happens with a lot of people is that it somehow is stimulating insulin, even though it's high fat and low carb. And there may just be properties of dairy as its function as a food for growth for mammals. I'm not really sure, but some people have no problem with it all, and then other people, like, they can't eat cheese or milk but they can have butter, and some people can't have butter but they can have ghee, right? Which is just butter that's had the very last particles of proteins and lactose strained out of it. So for me, I think probably a lot of people that wouldn't necessarily do well with cheese or yogurt might do fine with butter. And it's worth a try because it's delicious. It's easy to get. Like, it's just right there on the shelf. You don't have to ask the butcher for trimmings or try to find something special. And yeah, you can eat it on anything.
And it's so high in butyrate too. It should be so good for gut healing. When I heard her say that, I was like, she's so much more knowledgeable than I am. But but at the same time, I love butter.
What I've heard them say is that dairy itself isn't necessarily a problem for healthy people, but if you've already got some level of intestinal permeability, then it's more likely to be causing a problem, and that's why they insist that their patients at least start with not having dairy.
Yeah. Well, if people ever tell me they're gaining weight in the past, before I got into this conversation of maybe it is too much protein at a time, one of the first things I would say was, are you having a lot of dairy? And to me, it wasn't normally butter that it's always the heavy cream for most people. For me, especially. I've had people ask, are you ever afraid you'll lose too much weight on carnivore? And I just say, as long as heavy cream exists, no. I can always gain it right back as much as I want because heavy cream does that for me right away.
Interesting.
Yeah. And it also causes...
You're not alone.
I can lose my peace a little bit over it too. Like my food piece, steak is suddenly like, man, I just wish this was heavy cream. It gets
yogurt does that to me. It's I almost describe it as addictive. Like if I eat some, then I have this calling for more of it that I know has nothing to do with hunger because I don't want anything else.
Yeah, that's it. That is me and heavy cream. Yeah. Whipped, and it's 10 times worse.
Oh, yeah.
So much worse. There's a carnivore ice cream recipe that I make for my kids. It's just egg yolk and heavy cream. Oh, my gosh. It's pretty serious for me. It's good, but I have to it's really good. Okay, so if we're eating all this fat and we're limiting our protein to moderate amounts, in the past, I've always heard people say, 1 gram of protein for every pound of ideal body weight. That's been like the repeated gold standard. And I've heard some people say you could have 0.7 grams of protein for every pound of ideal body weight, but I wouldn't go any less than that. And it's like, okay, so I'm going to pull out my calculator here, check my Facebook. No, I'm just kidding. My ideal body weight, I'm just going to put in 135. And if you multiply times 0.7, that gives me 94 grams of protein for the day. And that is about what I'm getting. If I eat 4 ounces of meat a few times per day, I've been adding it up very roughly. I'm getting about 100 grams. So that works for me. I feel like, okay, I'm feeling good. Fine. Now, are you familiar with what Dr. Annette Bosworth recommends? Because it's not 0.7.
No. What is it?
All right. She says take your ideal body weight. So I'll put 135. Divide by 2.2. This is a very different answer.
So that's going to give you your kilograms, basically.
61 grams of protein per day. 61. Yeah. Well, to me, there's a big difference in 61 to 94. Now I'm a little nervous. Well, she does say in her courses that the rules are all a little bit different if you are in a state of ketosis, that you do not necessarily have to worry about hitting a certain calorie mark or hitting a certain protein mark. Are you worried about
I'm going to say yes, but I'm going to say no, and that it's actually, I think it's kind of dangerous. So,
tell me.
So the number that she gave, the 2.2 is just disguising the fact that it was designed in kilograms. Okay. So it's 1 gram per kilogram of ideal body weight. Your ideal body weight is 61. And so she's saying 61 grams of protein. I think that's too low based on studies that actually were done in people who were obese people fasting, and they wanted to give them just enough protein to prevent them from losing more protein than they were taking in.
Okay.
And I think the current state-of-the-art number is considered to be 1.4 to 1.6 grams per kilogram. So that would give you something like 85 for you.
Okay.
So the reason, normally when people give their different ideas, I just say, yeah, try that or don't try that. The reason I'm a little bit worried that it might be dangerous is because over the long term, if you don't get enough protein on a ketogenic diet, your body is very slowly catabolizing your own muscle to make up the difference.
Okay.
And it catabolizes all the tissues indiscriminately, including your heart. And so there have been deaths in the past from people who were on extreme low carb diets, who were given protein shakes that didn't have adequate protein in them, and there were deaths. So for short periods, I wouldn't worry about it. Like you could fast for 10 days and you're not going to have a heart attack, right?
Right.
But if this is a prolonged thing, I would start to worry about the difference of 20 grams a day.
Yeah. When
on the other hand,
go ahead.
She's totally right that there are differences, or there are at least theoretical differences in need when you're going into a highly ketogenic metabolism. Because remember at the beginning we were talking about gluconeogenesis and how you can make it out of protein. Well, that's what that need for protein is largely about. It's to make up the gluconeogenesis. But there are byproducts of fat metabolism that can also go into gluconeogenesis. And so that spares some protein.
Okay.
So I would just want to be really cautious in the long term.
Yeah. Are you familiar with protein recycling?
I think what you're probably referring to is when there's autophagy, where your body is breaking down old things that it doesn't need anymore. All of your cells are made out of protein and fat, and so there's protein that gets salvaged from that, and that can get reused. Yeah.
Okay, and I've heard some people say that's why that typically happens when glucose is low and ketones are high. And I think that is part of why people say that if you're in a state of ketosis, you may be able to have less protein. I have been trying to err a little bit on the side of caution with my whole, let's see, I've got notes from my group where I'll say, let's go with ideal body weight times 0.7, because, I feel like for me to have 94 to 100 grams of protein, like that feels very safe. And I am able to get I'm hitting excellent. Her Dr. Boz ratio, which is like the GKI, has been excellent. Really good eating that.
Good.
Yeah. Okay, you were going to say something else about the recycling, I think.
Oh, yeah. I was going to say it is actually an interesting argument that could be true, that I've heard some people say, especially in the fasting community, that if you are... So say, for example, you're fasting and you've lost a bunch of connective tissue that was holding fat together.
Okay.
That's going to have protein in it, and that's going to be broken down, and so you're going to use it. And so it does stand to reason that as you're repairing tissue and especially getting rid of unwanted tissue, that could contribute to your protein needs in a significant way. So I'll punt that a little bit.
Okay. It's possible.
But from, just based on the historical things that have happened, I would want to be careful.
And the other thing that worries me is there's not really a short-term issue that people will likely experience when it comes to low protein. So if you're lack of fat, you will right away know you're constipated, your mood's going to drop. There's some very immediate feedback.
Yeah.
But like you were saying, the effects of low protein can be kind of the long game. And I didn't see a lot. Is there anything that you would look for immediately? I would say lack of poor sleep, I think, could be an indicator.
Could be, yeah. Poor sleep often happens just from lack of energy availability, period.
Okay.
So if you're having, especially say you wake up halfway through the night and you sleep fitfully for the rest of, like the early morning hours, that's the period of time where you will be more sensitive to not having enough energy availability. Okay. So people who are anorexic can't sleep in the second half of the night.
Okay.
And people who are losing weight also sometimes have that to a lesser degree. But what you want is that you want constant energy availability in your body. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter where it's coming from. I would say get it in your bloodstream at all costs. If your body's not releasing it, then you'll have to eat it to make up the difference. Ideally, if you're losing weight, then that means your fat is coming out of the tissue and being used. Yes. So there's lots of energy available, and your brain and your body will know it. You will feel good, you'll sleep well, you'll be energetic, you'll be skipping down the road. But if you're eating less and your body's not giving it to you, the energy is just not going to be there, and your brain's going to feel that.
Yeah, I do think under-eating is probably the primary cause for poor sleep. And for most any issue, you're just not eating enough. I thought you were going to say
the number one carnivore problem, period.
Period.
People are so afraid to eat.
Yeah.
And I get it.
And whether that's fat or protein. Yeah. But if somebody is coming to you and saying, I'm eating lots and lots of meat, 2 big meals per day, and nothing is happening good for me. I don't feel great. I'm not healing. I'm not losing weight. Yeah. Let's give them maybe the most specific advice that we can without actually meeting this person, right? This is a hypothetical person, but what would, if you had 5 minutes to tell them what to try, what would you say?
Yeah. Well, I would definitely go with the thing that you were talking about, with multiple meals a day, multiple small meals a day, 2 to 1 in grams, fat to protein, and don't quit at a certain amount. Like, how do I put this? You wanted your 4th meal at the beginning. It was taking you to over 3,000 calories.
Yes.
That's okay. Like, eat when you're hungry, but make those smaller portions, a couple, at least maybe 3 hours apart.
Yes.
And have as many of those as you need, and see if that starts to get things moving.
Yeah. Would you encourage them to say, if you want to check your glucose and ketones to see if it's making a difference in that? Do you feel like that would be useful? A lot of my group members are checking that right now, and I find it fascinating. Some of them are finding it motivating. You think if they're motivated by that, awesome?
Yeah, I think if you aren't motivated by it, you should be able to just tell by your appetite and your energy levels and probably the scale. But we know how the scale can lie sometimes. But by all means, it'll be more information, and it'll be especially informative if you do get tempted to try something like fasting or eating less or going longer. Yeah. Because if your body is not giving up the fat, you will know when you don't provide it, because the energy and the ketones won't be there.
Because we know that there are a lot of people who do really well on just eat all the fatty meat you want advice. I mean, it's not like we're advising this for everybody, right? If somebody is out there and they are doing awesome, and maybe they're at a 70-30 ratio, but they feel good, they're losing weight, they're eating all of their meat in either 1 meal per day or 2 meals per day. I've just been telling people, like, if it's working for you and you feel good, I wouldn't mess with it. Does that sound okay to you?
Totally. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, kind of thing. But also, I think, for the vast majority of carnivores or people trying carnivore, I would suspect they don't need to do any of this.
Yeah.
Like, just eat meat. Just eat meat. And that's a really good place to start.
Okay.
And I would say only if you have ongoing problems that have persisted for, like, you've tried it for 3-4 weeks, nothing's budged. Yeah. Or, you see that your morning blood glucose is starting to rise or something weird like that.
Yes.
Then I would go there. But like you and I know, like, one of the most wonderful things about carnivore is how simple it is. And it feels almost like a betrayal to say, oh, now you've got to start counting things and measuring things. And it's just, it's like antithetical to the whole carnivore movement in a way. But special circumstances require special interventions.
Yeah, I had somebody send me an email and say, Kelly, I've always really loved following you because you always kept it simple. And here you are talking about ketones. I said, look, simple nailed it for me. life changed. And maybe it did for them too. Yeah, they did. They said, it worked for me. I don't know why you would change up. Said, if that were the case for everybody, I would have never taken this course. I would have never bought a ketone meter. It's just enough people came to me, and it's, again, not the majority, but it doesn't have to be the majority for me to care about it. Like, there were enough people saying, I've been doing that. And some of them said, it's been 2 years. Yeah. That's a long time to just keep saying, well, then eat more, eat more. And sometimes that advice is solid because what we said, the number one problem is under eating. Yeah. So eat more can fix it for some people.